On Being a Pagan. Alain de Benoist. Translated by John Graham, edited by Greg Johnson. 2004. Originally published in French under the title Comment peut-on, étre, paien? Under the pen name Albin Michel, 1981. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Chapter 13, Space and Time. From the creationist perspective, the main emphasis is placed on time and not on space. The account of Genesis transpires only in time and stages a history, which the Greeks, for example, would have interpreted spatially instead. In like fashion, if the biblical doctrine concerning personal retribution is unclear, it is because its paradise is confused with an absolute before, the Garden of Eden, or an absolute after, the Messianic era, whereas in classic pagan tradition, paradise is primarily a place, Valhalla, the Elysian Fields, or even Atlantis or the land of Cain, and, what's more, not a place that is radically distinguished from the real world. This is the reason time is generally considered, as stressed by Ernst von Dobschuetz in 1902, to play the role of exemplary container in Hebrew thought that was played by space in ancient European thought. Subsequently, while the Greeks paid special attention to the particularity of the elements of the tangible world, the Hebrews paid special attention to the events that transpired there. This makes it so that in the Bible, time ends by becoming identical with its content, whereas in paganism, it is the space that forms the world that tends to become identified with all the beings it contains. Hebrew man, declares Andrei Karakwi, lives in a verbal world where the notion of time trumps that of space, in which the duality between time and eternity does not exist. We are in fact in the presence here of a very distinctive conception of time, which is directly connected to the conception of history. Time in the Bible is not time by human standards. Time belongs only to Yahweh. The word for me in Hebrew, olam, is furthermore no different from the word for eternity. The Septuagint first translated olam as eternity, thereby creating an opposition between time and eternity that does not exist in Hebrew. Karakwi's translation uses the more correct word perenniality. On the other hand, Hebrew has no present tense and verbs only have two basic clauses, perfect and imperfect. In the Pentateuch the word kwadosk, holy, appears first as a description of the seventh day, which God chose as his day, and in the Ten Commandments the only two positive commandments are related to time. You will remember the day of the Sabbath and make it holy, weekly rhythm, and honor your mother and your father, so that you may extend your days, rhythm of the generations. Holiness in time thereby takes precedence over all others. Holiness in space appears only at the moment the Hebrews are commanded to build a tabernacle, which will be consecrated by Moses, Numbers 7:1. In classic European tradition, to the contrary, space is such a primordial assumption that we often conceive of time spatially. For example, we speak about a space of time. In the Bible, the Hebrew expression generally translated as the kingdom of God, time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God is near, Mark 1:15, an expression with a spatial resonance, in fact means to say reign of God, an expression with temporal resonance. We also tend to give spatial proportions to our conception of eternity, imagining it as something infinitely vast. Let's only bring up as reminders the desire for the conquest of space, which from the age of discovery to that of Star Wars, has not ceased to move us. It is this tendency to spatialize that has led Europe, after its conversion to Christianity, to reinterpret the notion of linear duration into a form that makes a clear-cut, almost palpable distinction between present, past, and future, whereas the Hebrew verb, which distinguishes only between completeness and incompleteness, consistently tends, if we accept Max Miller's contention that language is a crystallized philosophy, to qualify time, not from the human perspective but from that of God, which his nature necessarily places above historic time. Judeo-Christianity therefore entirely reverses the pagan problematic. Whereas this latter tends to believe that the world is eternal, while gods, like men, are not, Judeo-Christian monotheism asserts that God is eternal, but the world began and will end. These differences of sensibility are explicable by their backgrounds. As Gilbert Durand notes in his commentary on Spengler, far from being an a priori form of sensibility on the same plane as space, time is the antinomy of space. The true intuition of time is that of a direction, a meaning. To the contrary, in space nothing is predetermined in advance about the forms that will be created there. Here everything is much more directly dependent upon man. Asserting the primacy of space is, let me repeat, indirectly exalting man's power. Also, behind the opposition of time and space emerges another that is equally fundamental, between the time eternity over which Yahweh rules and human time, which is a specifically historical ime. This opposition is the classic one from antiquity between intensity and duration. Unable to master time by very reason of his own finite existence, pagan man masters it through the intensity of his actions, and by the resulting intensity of the constructions specific to it. This seems to be what Nietzsche was alluding to in a famous passage from the Antichrist, in which he recalls what Christianity, the vampire of the Imperium Romanum, had contributed to the undoing of the Romans' magnificent creation. The tremendous deed of the Romans in clearing the ground for a great culture which could take its time was undone overnight by Christianity. The desire for creation flows logically out of this desire for intensity, as do the desire for form and the desire for style. By all evidence, the Bible's choice is duration. Furthermore, the intensity of human actions tries, in the strict sense, the patience of Yahweh. We find here the confrontation between a purely linear conception of time and a cyclical or spherical conception, which accepts, among other things, the eternal return of the same. There is no possibility of return in Judeo-Christian monotheism. History cannot turn back on itself. It is going somewhere, toward a never-seen event which will be its culmination and its end. Or rather, if there is a return, it is on a whole different level. The end of history will be the equivalent of a return to the state that existed before history, but this return will be an absolute return. It will not be one return among others, an eternal dialectical movement of always starting over, but the radical affirmation, the sign of an absolute end of time, the reabsorption of human history called upon to close itself like a parenthetical expression. On the other hand, there is no spatial or geographical return either. Levinas hit the nail on the head when he wrote, "To the myth of Ulysses returning to Ithaca, we seek to oppose the history of Abraham leaving his native land forever for one still unknown and forbidding his servant from even bringing his son back to this departure point. In the Bible, one must never go back, one must leave. To leave the city, peut-on, Babylon, which are human undertakings and places of perdition, but also subsequently places of redemption. It was in the cities that newborn Christianity made its most spectacular progress, and go toward the promised land. The Jewish destiny, declares Shemuel Trigano, is to always be leaving in Chaldea for Eretz Israel. In fact, the arrival point is all that matters, a point determined, in the same way as the arrival point of history, by the promise of the covenant and not the point of origin. Eretz Israel is not a point of origin. It is not where the men of the Bible were engendered. Before being conquered, Eretz Israel was a gift land, attributed and promised by Yahweh. Pagan man feels the place of his birth through its relation to his ancestral lineage. He has a mother country. In biblical monotheism, to the contrary, there is no native land, there is only a final land, the land of destination that does not derive from any founding myth but clearly from a finality. Singularly enough, this finality is more temporal than spatial, as its appropriation constitutes a prerequisite for the advent of messianic times. The land of Israel was promised twice, first to Moses by Yahweh, Exodus 6:8, 23:20-33, when it still belonged to the Hittites, Amorites, and Canaanites, then during the time of the prophets. I am going to take the Israelites from among all the nations where they have gone. I am going to gather them from all directions and reunite them on their ground. I will make them one nation in the land, in the mountains of Israel, Ezekiel 37:21-22. It is still promised much in the same way a fiancé was once promised to a man. In fact, Eretz Israel constitutes the fiancé, the future wife of the Hebrews. The Bible develops this nuptial symbolism at length. The law of the Sinai constitutes the ketubah, the marriage contract. The people of Israel are not children of a land, they are the sons of Yahweh, in a filial relationship whose ambiguous nature I have attempted to describe earlier. It is not on the land of Israel, by birth and heritage, that this people was formed, but in Egypt and in the desert, through a moral and religious act. Eretz Israel is a fiancée, a wife, but she cannot become a mother, one of those earth mothers worshipped by the idolatrous. It is a land that was made natal only through contractual proxy, it is a native land that owes nothing to birth. Hence the entire theology of exile and return, in the limits I have indicated, combined with that of silence and the word. It is also found, perhaps further away and repeated, in the Freudian Oedipal theory that views repression of an unresolved attachment to the mother as the source of neurosis, just as the prophets made persistent attachment to the earth mother a source of idolatry. This comparison can nonetheless be interpreted in different ways. In Genesis, one of Cain's characteristic features was his desire for boundaries. He wished to materialize his ownership. According to one midrash, if Cain killed Abel, it was because the latter did not want to respect a division of property that the two had agreed upon. Under the terms of this division, Cain had obtained this world and Abel the future world. But Abel then argued that he had rights over this world too, because, strictly speaking, as the world had only one creator, it could not truly be divided. In my opinion, this makes Cain's wrath quite understandable. Condemned to exile and having settled in the land of Nod, Genesis 4:16, Cain then makes the distinctively pagan choice of intensity versus duration, space versus time eternity. By constructing a city, as we have seen, he was visibly seeking to lay the foundations of a kingdom or an empire, and this is where his pride resided. He transformed, as Eisenberg and Abecassis properly put it, his temporal issue into a spatial one. The attitude developed by the Bible with respect to setting down roots is therefore extremely ambiguous. A sedentary lifestyle, in opposition to a nomadic one, is given a negative value. Eisenberg and Abecassis go so far as to read in it a condemnation of patriotism as a pagan sentiment based on man's physical relationship to the earth, identical to the filial relationship in which the child is determined genetically. Freedom with respect to sedentary lifestyles is, perhaps, the human form of being in the world, Levinas declares, which is only a half-truth, because specifically human freedom vis-à-vis a fixed dwelling cannot be construed as legitimizing the principle of rejecting all fixed dwellings. It is also curious to see how the Sukkoth feast, originally a typically agrarian feast, see Deuteronomy 16:13-16, subsequently became a nomadic one. Even after the formation of the Kingdom of Israel and the settlement upon the Promised Land, the nomadic vocation continued to be embodied by the Jerem, whose life is a long pilgrimage. It was from among them that were recruited, around 900 BC, the first sectarian Rechabites, when nomadism was regarded not as a simple lifestyle but as an effective means of saving the covenant's principles. It was also among the Jerem that the Levites were found, a caste who following the return to Canaan defined themselves as the landless tribe and continued to pursue an ideal that appears to have triumphed following the destruction of the Second Temple. By refusing the land, states André Neyer, the Levites also refused Canaanite civilization, which was essentially sedentary. The economic life of Canaan was based on agriculture and commerce. Now the Levites would not Canaanize themselves at all. Alone among the Hebrews, they did not devote themselves to farming, as did other Hebrews upon entering Canaan, or to commerce, as other Hebrews did later, when the richest parts of the land had fallen under their control. The universe is thus conceived in the Bible as a world with no spatial boundaries but limited in ame, whereas in paganism it is considered to be limitless in time but a place where man has the duty to draw spatial boundaries. Frontiers established in space establish man as the master of the space he occupies. Boundaries in time, absolute caesuras, only show what distinguishes man from God. In the one case there are established roots and specificity, in the other, the vocation to universalism and deterritorialization. Settlement within a country, attachment to a place, without which the world would become insignificant and hardly exist, writes Levinas again, is the very scission of humanity into autochthones and foreigners. In principle, though, this scission does not imply either rejection or scorn. Rather it forms the primary condition for the maintenance and respect of collective differences. It is not so certain that the same holds true for the ideal of the abolition of frontiers, which Thorleif Bowman regards, according to the Bible, as the normal state if not final destination of the world. An ideal which is very close, in any case, to the very contemporary apologia of the man with the soles of the wind, the deluso guadarist rhizome, as opposed to the root, and of universal nomadism, in a world where the non-place of the desert's anonymity tends to be replaced by the non-place of the urban environment's anonymity, whereas the world cities are no longer the places where history works toward its fulfillment but rather the site of its simulacrum and annihilation. André Caracqui speaks of a verbal world. It is the activity, of man, that produces intensity, but it is the word, of Yahweh, that acts upon duration. In the Bible, the word is the decisive reality of the world of lived experience. In the extreme case, the world is commingled with the word that created it. In Hebrew the same word, davar, can mean either object or word. In paganism the decisive reality of the world of lived experience is the result of action. Goethe's phrase, "In the beginning there was the action," responds to the phrase in the scriptures, "In the beginning there was the word." In the face of the symphony that reigns in pagan religions, the Bible therefore poses silence as the metaphysical form of the cosmos. André Neyer, silence where only the logos, the word of Yahweh, resonates, although in the final instance, the being of that particular being can only be identical to silence as well. The Judeo-Christian world is a world that has been issued from the Word. This is why the name of Yahweh, an unspeakable name, is declared all-powerful, see Psalms 8. It is the Word that creates the bond between created being and non-created being. One reads in Genesis, God said, "Let there be light," 1-3. One enters the dynamic phase of the creation through the intermediary of the Logos. In the Bible, to do is linked with to say, with what is expressed and heard, with what is uttered and understood from the onset. Spoken or written, the word is revelation, a sublimation of verbal motor behavior. When the Elohim take Adam to place him in the Garden of Eden, Genesis 2:15, this taking is effectuated by the word. This is also the failure of Cain's words to Abel, Genesis 4:8, which prompted the fratricide. And likewise, finally, the fact that the world was created by 10 words, In the rabbinical tradition, the phrase, "in the beginning," is considered as one word, the 10th, which is added to the other 9. It is through 10 words, 10 commandments, that God gave Moses his law on Mount Sinai.